And this is the next lesson on modern medicine and the treatment of illness in this period. And this is a real big lesson because it's something that affects us every day. It's something that helps us potentially every day if we needed it. It's the development of the National Health Service and also looking at technological advancements. Now, what we need to look at for this lesson is that, firstly, how the NHS was set up in 1948, what services it offers, how it helps us as a country, and how it also helped the development of treatment. Now, the quite scary thing is, if you think about it, is that before 1948, people had to pay, or quite a large amount of people had to pay for their treatment. And this led to a gulf in, who could afford treatment and who couldn't. If we just put it into context, when the NHS started in 1948, it was free at the point of access. Now, that caused some issues, especially with things like dentistry. 3 million people saw a dentist for the first time in their life after the NHS developed. So the National Health Service is something that, even though we have to pay for some of it today, for example, dentistry, we have to pay for some of it, we only pay a very diluted amount. The National Health Services, the point of the National Health Service is to be all-inclusive, to provide treatment at the first point of access, okay? So, I'm just going to show you a little passage. We're going to read through it. There's some key words here. And this is something I want you to complete to start off with. So the National Health Service was launched in 1948 by the blank. Its aim was to provide medical care for the blank population of Britain. It was paid for national insurance contributions taken from blank in the same way as tax. So the National Health Service is paid for through national insurance contributions. Okay. So, and you'll understand a bit more about that when you start paying it when you're older, but it just means it's something that can provide the National Health Service with the money that it needs to operate. It was the largest government intervention in medical care. I mean, this is miles away from the laissez-faire government that we had in the industrial period. The government were now involved, the government were now wanting to make sure that public health and public treatment was at the forefront of their thinking. The new NHS took over existing hospitals and medical services. The blank of the NHS was made up of 3 parts. So you have hospitals, which are managed by regional hospital boards. Remember, the government aren't fully controlling these regional hospital boards. If something were to go wrong, the government would step in and get involved. So this concept of hospitals being managed by regional hospital boards is important. You've got GPs, general practitioners, and dentists, otherwise known as blank care. So you can go and see your GP. So you don't necessarily need to go to hospital if you're sick. You can just go to your GP or your dentist, and this is known as something care, which you can work out. And additional services such as the blank service and health visitors. If you don't know what a health visitor is someone that will come and see you if you've had, say, an operation, or you have general health problems, which means you can't get to a hospital. They will come and see you. They might look after you for a bit. They'll give you medication and then leave. Health visitor of people who might be vulnerable, to be looked after, to make sure that they can still get the same level of treatment that they would get via hospital, via GP. The government aimed to provide the same level of service for everyone in the country, no matter how rich or blank they were. That's the key thing. The NHS was accessible at the point of contact. For example, workers earning a certain amount were already entitled to medical care through the 1911 National Insurance Act. So if you're rich prior to 1948, you could get treatment. You were already entitled to medical care. But this didn't extend to blank who were at home raising their families. After 1948, women were able to get treatment for blank conditions like varicose veins, which might previously have been left untreated. If they're left untreated, it can cause quite significant pain for your whole life. Similarly, children could be treated for minor problems before there was any lasting blank. So there's 2 tasks I want you to do with this. First of all, fill in the gaps. Okay, so I'll write it here. Number 1, fill in the gaps. Number 2, write down any reasons why the NHS was a positive for treatment. So think about, what does it offer? Why is it different? Why is it Why is it positive? Think about all the different things. So for example, if you've got, say for example, dentists, well, let's think, well, seeing a dentist for free is going to allow for basic mouth hygiene, which will ensure patients can be tracked for issues with their teeth. Also, things such as mouth cancer, gum disease, all of this can be tracked by a dentist, and there's no excuse because the sum of money or the treatment is diluted. You know, if you were to go to, let's say for example, a private doctor and have a blood test can be in the range of £200. The NHS, free. Before the NHS, you could say that an ambulance ride, in today's society, could be about £120. NHS, free. It's really important you understand the little things like this, and this is why in modern media, there's a lot of criticism about people that abuse the NHS because of how much certain things are. You know, a stay in the intensive care could be about £5,000 a day because of the nurses, because of the constant treatment, because of the machinery, because of the medication. So the NHS and the access to care was a massive turning point. You spend 5 minutes now just doing this, and then we will move forward and go and look at what problems the NHS faced at the very start of their life and how that overcame. So, the next bit. The NHS, when it first started in 1948, now the problem that people have in this exam is they tend to write their own personal opinion of the NHS. The exam board don't care about your personal opinion of the NHS. The exam board care about you understanding what problems it had at the start, how they were overcome, and the problems that it might face today. But there is no way that should turn into a personal rant about the NHS. So early limitations. So first of all, you've got to understand that NHS was created in 1948. Britain would just come out of the Second World War in 1945. So please remember that key date there, 1948. That's such an important date to understand. So post-war Britain didn't have a lot of money to spend on changing hospitals. Many of the hospitals in our country were built in the 1800s. The government didn't have the money to be able to modernise these hospitals, which caused problems. The government took on 1,143 voluntary hospitals and another 1,545 city hospitals. So it was a huge undertaking for the government to be able to take on a significant amount of hospitals in such a short space of time and make sure that they're run correctly. In terms of spread of hospitals, there were more hospitals in London and the South East than there were across the rest of the country. GP surgeries also needed modernising because they were built in the 19th century. The GPs in themselves were very behind the times. They were traditional general practitioners, they were behind the times, and they needed to be modernised and improved. There was an increased demand, which meant waiting times went up, but appointment times went down. So people were waiting longer for an appointment, but when they did get to see their doctor, the appointment time went down because the doctor was so busy. There was a lot of opposition from doctors to accept this National Health Service, and many doctors decided to go private. But those that did accept the National Health Service had promises from the government that they would get the money to be able to run it effectively. Access has improved, but provision had not, meaning people could get free treatment, but as there were so many people, it became more difficult to see a doctor. For example, 7 million people saw a dentist for the first time after the NHS developed, which meant it needed to change. So this would be perfect for a 16 marker, a judgment question, because if you get a question saying explain why there was change in treatment, you're only going to talk about the good things. But if you get a how far do you agree question that the NHS was the main reason for change, you can talk about the negatives as well. So your first task for this is explain the problems that the NHS faced before it began at the very start. So write a paragraph explaining why there are problems. So remember, this is after sort of they hit the ground running. That task is probably pretty poorly worded, actually. So explain the problems the NHS faced when it began, at the very start, not before it began. For example, I've given you an example here at the bottom. There were lots of hospitals in the south of England. This would cause a huge problem because, to get you thinking about it, how can they improve this? How can the government improve this? The way to improve this would be spend about 10 minutes on this and then move on to the next task, which I'm going to be sharing what the government did to be able to take it one step further. So when we look at the NHS and the improvements, there's a few key things. So first of all, improvements were made in the 60s. So there were plans to ensure that hospitals were evenly spread across the country. Couldn't just be diluted in the south and in London. In 1966, now a good way to remember this is the year England won the World Cup. It was also the year the GP Charter was introduced, which encouraged GPs to work in group practices with incentives to keep up with medical developments. Basically, GPs were told you had to keep up with medicine. You had to keep up with knowledge. You couldn't just, it's a bit like a teacher. You know, we're always learning about different and new ways of teaching. GPs were taught about new ways of helping their patients. They had to keep up with it. NHS was managed and funded, a lot more organisation that helped people build trust, so the government was seen as genuinely competent to help the NHS grow and develop. Now, on top of the NHS being introduced, the NHS also has high-tech medical and surgical treatments. So this is something you could talk about in an exam question. The treatment in hospitals changed a lot since 1900. Treatment that we think is routine today, like blood transfusions, weren't a thing before 1900. Now, what patients are benefiting from today is a high-tech treatment, which means that the main problems of surgery before had now near enough been sorted. And there's hundreds of examples of high-tech medical technology, and we're going to look at a few of them now. To help you develop this, obviously in the exam, you'd have to explain how this would help people. So you've got technological advancements. You have advanced x-rays. Doctors can now use x-rays to shrink tumours known as radiotherapy. This, alongside chemotherapy, is an effective treatment of cancer. Now, whereas before, treatment of cancer might not have been even an existent sort of possibility. And if it was, you definitely wouldn't have got treatment for it unless you were one of the very rich. Remember, we now have an understanding of how cancer can be treated, but there is no definitive cure for it. So radiotherapy can shrink tumours, and then you can have chemotherapy or surgery to try and remove the tumour after it's shrunk. You also have small, cheap machines, okay? Whereas before, machines would have cost an astronomical amount. Because of the influx of government intervention, and also the fact that people are developing more machines at a faster rate, they become cheaper. So things like dialysis, for example, where the blood of a kidney failure patient is washed. And dialysis is something that people might have to stay on for years while they're waiting for a kidney transplant. And you also have heart bypasses, which a machine works your heart. These machines have become more available because they are cheaper. They are much smaller, so the patient can, for example, heart bypass can still live a relatively comfortable life. And because they're more readily available, it means that people can live waiting for a transplant, for example, kidney failure, under dialysis. It's not the most ideal treatment because they have to go to hospital regularly for dialysis. It's not something you can do at home. But it means that because it's cheaper, it's more accessible. Robotics. So you have better prosthetic limbs that are now available, made of better material. So prosthetic people who have lost limbs, so for example in war of Iraq, they saw a huge influx of people that lost limbs. People now can live better, more comfortable lives because the prosthetics available allow them to do this. You even have Paralympians that are, they didn't lose their limbs in wars, but Paralympians, or some did. Paralympians have limbs, prosthetic limbs that allow them to be first-class athletes, world-class athletes. That means they can live a life with elements of normality. You also have microsurgery. Now, transplants have become possible. Now, this is a huge turning point for treatment because it means that people can live longer, especially if their organs are failing. So you had the first kidney transplant in 1956 on identical twins, lungs in 1963, and hearts in 1967. Now, the key thing with microsurgery is it allows the nerve endings to blood vessels to attach, which means that transplants can be successful. It's a very, very difficult surgery, but it's something which allows transplants to be accepted rather than rejected. There are a few occasions where transplants are rejected, but due to microsurgery, the nerve endings, the blood vessels, can be attached, which means these surgeries can be successful. You also have keyhole surgery, which is using tiny cameras and small surgical instruments. Surgeons can operate through small cuts some distance away from the body, so you don't need to cut the whole body open to surgically help someone. Keyhole surgery is a small surgery. That means that most people, if it's a like a gallbladder removal, they can be out in the same day. And then you've got something which is even more of a technological sort of miracle, which is robotic surgery. Surgeons use computers to control instruments inside the body, allows for more precise surgery and allows more advanced surgery, for example, brain surgery. You've got to remember, some of these parts of the body are so difficult. Your brain surgery is very difficult, and if a slight mistake can change someone's life forever. So robotic surgery allows the person to be a lot, metal robotic hands at times might be steadier than humans. Having these robotic surgery and the surgeon controlling it allows steadier surgery and possibly allows for more successful treatment for the patient. So as an overview, I've just finished the lesson with this. Which interpretation do you agree with the most and why? Interpretation 1 says the implementation of the NHS by no means resolved the problem of delivering adequate healthcare to Britain's people, although it did offer considerable improvement over the combination of private and insurance medicine that had preceded it. The medical services offered under the 1948 Act were preeminently providers of treatment for existing illness rather than agents for preventing its development. What that's saying is, NHS is all right. It didn't help the prevention of disease. It just helped with treatment, but it gave adequate healthcare. It didn't offer considerable improvement. And then interpretation 2, creating the NHS was the greatest act of modernisation ever achieved by a Labour government. It banished the fear of becoming ill that had for many years blighted the lives of millions of people. Which one do you agree with? Basically, interpretation 1 saying it's all right, but it's not great. Interpretation 2 saying it's the biggest change that a Labour government has ever introduced. It's a huge, significant impact to the treatment of disease. If you finish off with that, and that's your overview on the NHS, which allows you to develop a paragraph on this for the GCSE.